What is an IEP? An IEP is an individualized education plan that is developed by a team for students with disabilities. This team consists of a special education teacher, a general education teacher, a parent or parents, the student when old enough, and any other person the student or parents feel is beneficial to have at the meeting. The team identifies the student's strengths and weaknesses to develop a plan to help the student be successful in school. I teach high school students who have disabilities. Their ages range from 14 to 19 years old. Through a quick informal survey, I found that my students knew they had an IEP, but had no idea what having an IEP meant. This is why I decided to teach my students about what an IEP actually is. This is also one of my curriculum assistance course objectives. The twist to my project is that I taught two different groups of students about IEPs by using different learning theories. The first lesson I taught focused on the cognitive theory of learning. I used the concept of an IEP as the basis for my lesson. My students were all able to state that they have an IEP, but struggled when it came to explaining what their IEP does for them. I used this prior knowledge of students having an IEP to build my students' new knowledge of what an IEP actually is. The lesson started off with a quick journal entry, during which my students wrote what they knew about an IEP. From here, I read two different articles to them as they followed along. The articles gave information as to what an IEP is and how their IEP applies to them. After reading the articles to my students, I had them write an essay that addressed 5 questions. These questions include: 1. What is an IEP? 2. Who develops an IEP? 3. What is a transition plan? At what age do you start to have a transition plan? 4. How does having an IEP affect you personally? And 5. Is it important for you to be present at your own IEP? Why or why not? I found that my students were able to use their learned strategies to answer the following questions with word-for-word answers from the text I provided them with. This is a strategy that I have taught my students to use when they are asked to answer questions after reading text. This is an example of the information processing component of the cognitive theory, in which students are able to acquire facts. My role during this lesson was to model effective strategies for my students and to determine if my students were successful with their roles of actively processing the information. I evaluated what students learned by reading their essays. The second lesson also taught students about the purpose of an IEP and what an IEP includes. But this time, the lesson was focused on the social constructivism theory. The lesson started off the same way, with my students writing a journal entry about what they think an IEP is. The responses I got were: an IEP is when you have a learning disability, or an IEP is a meeting that occurs. Yes, both of these answers are correct statements, but there is much more to what an IEP is, and I wanted my students to gain a better understanding of what an IEP includes. After my students wrote in their journals, I read the same 2 articles aloud that I used in my first lesson. This time, instead of having my students write an essay about the information presented, I split my students into 2 groups. Each student had a role within his or her group. These roles included time master, material gatherer, and information organizer. When my students were in their groups, they had 10 minutes to discuss the same 5 questions. As a review, these questions include: 1. What is an IEP? 2. Who helps develop an IEP? 3. What is a transition plan, and at what age do you start to have a transition plan? 4. How does having an IEP affect you personally? And 5. Is it important for you to be present at your own IEP? Why or why not? The students created a plan for how they were going to present the information on a poster. Students contributed to their group's discussion. This is a component of the social constructivism learning theory. During these group discussions, I played the role of facilitator. I listened to the group's discussion and helped clear up any misunderstandings my students had regarding an IEP. After my students had time to collaborate and create their posters, they had a few minutes to decide who would speak when they presented their posters to the class. After my students finished presenting their projects, which addressed the 5 questions, I was able to clear up any misconceptions that they may have had. I have included one misconception in the following video clip.
who helps develop an IEP? Well, a lot of people ask that, so we said parents, because they do a lot of that, because they're the one who decides it, and special education teachers, because they help with special education. Regular education teachers, like regular education. Representative from school district, like the school board and stuff. And
Students stated that the school board is present during a student's IEP. This is a huge misconception that I had to clear up. As a whole class, we went over the individuals who are present during an IEP meeting. I am now confident that my students are able to identify the individuals who make up a typical IEP team. Comparing the two different learning theories, I feel that my students were able to have a better understanding when they were taught using the social constructivism theory for this particular lesson. Every student is different and learns information differently. However, I think that it is important to give students time to talk through information. I think students who are able to have conversations about material that they are learning are able to make connections to prior knowledge more easily. I also feel that as a teacher, I was able to correct students' misconceptions when they worked in groups and had group discussions.